Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. And thank you for attending today. My name is Kim Cicchini, and I'm the Senior Director of Corporate Communications for SolarWinds MSP. And we're excited to welcome Artie Kola, the GDPR Program Director at the Henley Business School, and author of the highly anticipated and soon to be released GDPR Handbook. So as we closed out the transition period, was just talking with a colleague about whether we're going to have balloons and fireworks tomorrow with GDPR going into full effect. Artie is going to kick off our webinar series on GDPR with a look at the really important topic of legitimate interest. Please note that we will not be taking live questions during today's presentation, but please do enter any questions that you have into the chat box. And we will be delivering an FAQ that Artie has graciously agreed to help us with after the session that addresses all of your questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Artie. Welcome, Artie.
Thank you very much, Kim, and it's a real pleasure to speak with you and the team at SolarWinds, and also for everyone who has taken the time out to join us this afternoon if you're in the States, and in fact this afternoon if you're in the UK and Europe too. So I thought there's lots of issues and challenges and opportunities that we could focus on, but this is something which has come up time and time again, the legal basis for processing personal data. And I hope through the course of the next hour you'll have a strong sense of really what is appropriate and what you should think about doing when you're thinking about processing the personal data of your customer, your client, if you're a voluntary sector organization, your supporter, and we'll also touch about employees as well, because they're pretty important too. But it may sound a bit strange that we were just about to get into this whole GDPR new landscape, which opens for all of us tomorrow, Friday, the 25th of May. But I actually want to turn the clock back just for a little bit. And in fact, go back to 1999. You probably remember Prince had a track, didn't he, Kim, called 1999, you know, from the album Purple Rain. That's got nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I thought you might remember 1999. But in 1999, this book came out, Permission Marketing by Seth Godin. Amazing speaker. If you get the chance to have a look at his TED Talks, they're really, really brilliant. And Seth, for me, really sums up what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. We've now moved away from thinking that actually marketing, which is effectively what we're talking about here this afternoon, is all about what our needs and requirements are, and turning the telescope around and thinking about the individual, the customer, the client, if you like. In many respects, we'll be talking a bit about employees a bit later, but if we just focus on the customer and the client, we're living in a world now where there's so much media, there is so much communication that actually it's very difficult to get your messages through. And this is something which hasn't just happened overnight. This has happened over, well, you know, almost 20 years, really. And certainly one of the key thinkers in this space is Seth Godin, and he was thinking about permission as a basis for marketing. And his comment, I think, is very relevant for all of us today. Permission marketing is the privilege, not the right, of delivering anticipated, personal, and relevant messages to people who actually want to get them. Does that sound familiar? It should, because in fact, that's kind of the direction of travel for the GDPR. And it's kind of the thing that is going to navigate how we do our sales and marketing and how we communicate with customers and prospects and people moving forward. And that's really important. It's really important because data drives everything now, and you don't have to watch the television screens to see Mark Zuckerberg giving evidence to the European Parliament or the latest data breach and to get a feel for how people are worried about where their data is going and how it's being used. It's everywhere. And this is another quote which I think is also quite instructional. GDPR is about getting companies and organizations to step up and take responsibility for the data that's so much part of our digital world. I don't think any one of us on this webinar would disagree with that statement. And what what Liz goes on to say is that this isn't a back office, backroom issue anymore. And traditionally, we've always thought about doing all the kind of fancy stuff and the campaigns and sales stuff and points of sale and 48 sheet posters and television advertising and all this other stuff and PR as well within the mix. And that's all great. But actually, what drives all of that is data. And so data has to become part of our world in a very powerful way. So it's about taking that really seriously. And of course, it's become less of a backroom issue now and much more of a boardroom issue. And that's something that Liz Denham, who's the Information Commissioner here in the UK, she's particularly keen to get the attention of the boardroom. Now, there's plenty of stuff out there in relation to this subject of consent, legitimate interest, how you go about marketing to people and selling to them. And we could spend the whole hour just talking about the different sources. I do have at the end of the webinar some cool links that you can access, and hopefully those will be helpful to you. But one thing I wanted to bring to your attention quite early on, I suppose, in this is a piece of work, very nice piece of work, written in ordinary language, produced by the Direct Marketing Association, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about falls into that area of direct marketing. And this is what they said. They published it in January. It's still very relevant and definitely worth downloading, and you can get that for free from just typing their details into Google or whatever. What they say is, under the GDPR, the default position is that the individual is the owner of their data. Really, really important. In fact, that's always been the case, but we forgot about that a little bit. So the default position is to give the individual choice and control over how their data is used. And in a way, it goes back to what we were just talking about a few moments ago with respect to permission, if you like, and the idea of permission. You know, think about consent, if you like, in the context of permission as well. Now, what they say, remember, these guys are funded, the Direct Marketing Association are funded by some of the biggest brand owners in the world, the likes of Coca-Cola and Unilever and Procter & Gamble and a whole range of others. So they're very much on the brand owner side of the equation, but this is what they say: brands that fail to take responsibility lose customers, goodwill, and ultimately shareholder value. And we've seen that in many senses and many examples of that. I suppose one that comes to mind, because I was just reading about it this morning, in fact, is TalkTalk. TalkTalk is a telecoms broadband company which had all sorts of problems in this area in relation to data protection and privacy. And they kept getting it wrong and they kept getting fined. So they weren't really learning through their mistakes, if you like, and it had such an immediate impact on their business. They lost something like 25% of their share price, which is what this quote talks about. They also lost customers, so there was a churn. There was an increase in the churn rate as well. And I was just reading this morning that they've had to issue a profits warning because they're actually in the red, which is not good. This is quite a big company, and of course the chief exec has left as well. I'm not saying for a minute it's all to do with data protection, privacy and security, but it had a large part to do with the problems that they're still having today. Now, the flip side is the end of this quote. Those brand owners, those brands that can demonstrate good data governance, will find customers trusting them more and sharing their data, which should lead to better revenues. And I think this is so important. This is the reason why we're taking time out of what we're doing right now to kind of think about what the really important stuff is. And the important stuff, I would say, throughout this webinar is to think about how do we strengthen and deepen digital trust in order to do more, not less, with personal data. And I was extremely fortunate recently to be working with the team in Amsterdam at their conference, and that was definitely a theme that we were definitely keen to share with everyone. And indeed, if you're interested in that and would like to see more, then you could go to Facebook on the SolarWinds site and have a look at that. The other thing to remember is, although there are opportunities, there's also responsibility, because with every freedom comes responsibility. I try to tell my kids that. I fail sometimes. But with everything in life, there's opportunity, there's responsibility. And the responsibility for us on this webinar is to do our best to reduce risk, because that's what the GDPR is about. It's about risk mitigation. That's how they call it, and that's risk mitigation, reducing the chance of harm or damage happening to our customer, our client, our prospect, our supporter, if we're a voluntary sector organization, our employee, reducing that to a residual risk, which then doesn't cause harm and damage. And that's really, really important. It's something which, again, the European Commission talk about quite often as well. And it leads me to really put on the screen something I think is really important. It's about trust. It's a conversation I had last year, in fact, with the Lord Mayor here in London. And he asked us to deliver a workshop ahead of the GDPR. And we did that in February. And his whole mission is about trust in business. In many respects, the GDPR, which actually is about rebuilding trust as well, where that may have been eroded or broken, but also strengthening those relationships so people feel more comfortable about sharing their personal data. So, and that applies to everyone listening to this webinar. You don't feel comfortable sharing your personal data, you're not going to do it, and you're not probably going to buy lots of products and services from those people who you don't completely trust. It kind of makes sense. It's a very human thing. And the other thing I would suggest is, why would you have a friend if you couldn't trust them? You know, that person by definition wouldn't necessarily be your friend. So I think it permeates all our lives, both business life and social life, and it's something which was very important in the mind of the current Lord Mayor, and it's something which is not going to go away. If anything, the whole Facebook and Cambridge Analytica episodes that we're seeing unfold, and the apology tour, as we call it, is all about this, isn't it? It's all about trust, or the lack of trust. So, having got those points out of the way, and before we get into the nitty-gritty of consent and legitimate interest, I want everyone to start to think about things in a slightly different way. And it means we have to reboot our thinking and put the nature of data protection, privacy, and security at the forefront of our mind, not at the back of our mind. And I think you'll find that really helpful. Here's an interesting slide, and you'll see there that there is a kind of history behind what we're talking about this afternoon, going back to 2002, where we had the e-privacy directive, then leading to the Privacy in Electronic Communications Directive as well, PECA as it's known in shorthand form, which we're going to be talking about today. That will then be replaced, not this year, it will be replaced next year by what we call the e-privacy regulation. And don't panic, we will give you a bit of a sense of what's likely to be in it. I've been talking to a few people about that in the European Commission and a member of that committee as well. So I've got a bit of a feel for where that may go. Now, of course, talking about where we're going, the UK, of course, is heading for the exit door, as we all know, to the European Union, but it's not leaving Europe, thank goodness. So we're leaving the European Union, and but before we leave and cut all our ties, we have just passed, and it comes into force tomorrow, our own Data Protection Act 2018. So perhaps the balloons and the champagne corks can start popping tomorrow. Maybe not right now, but it is new. Now, lots of other countries have done the same thing. I don't mean leave the European Union, I mean pass their own data protection laws, because the GDPR allows countries to do what I call, and this is a very technical term, wriggle room. They have some wriggle room to pass their own laws in certain areas, and actually, in reality, not that many. So there is a bit more of a consistent approach, more harmonized approach to how we look at data protection, privacy, and security across the whole of the European Union, all 28 member states, and that of course will be 27 when the UK leaves the European Union next year, next March. So we have to see the GDPR in context of other things that are happening, and so we'll unpack that a bit more. So of course tomorrow, being the 25th of May, is the first day when the GDPR can be fully enforced. A lot of people think it comes into existence on the 25th of May, and certainly I've been doing a few media and broadcast interviews, and I had to put the record straight. So in fact, the BBC ran an item saying what I had just said to you now, which I thought was a bit strange because I thought everyone knew that. It was actually law back in 2016, and we were given a 2-year transition period, which is just about to run out, in order to kind of reboot our thinking, to get ready for doing business in this new landscape. And that's really why it was there. And actually, if we ignored that transition period, if we didn't do anything to change our behavior, look at organizational and technical measures, so we're constantly thinking about how can we reduce that risk that I was talking about, mitigate that risk, reduce it to a residual risk which doesn't cause problems, then if there is a personal data breach post Friday this week, that's the first time I've ever managed to ever say that sentence. So post Friday this week, we haven't taken those opportunities, then that's going to be an aggravating factor, which sadly, if we are in a situation where we've caused a data breach, then the fact that we've done nothing is going to actually turn the needle up, not down, in terms of any sanction and fine. At the same time, the changes aren't over yet. As I said earlier, we have got the e-privacy regulation coming over the horizon, and that's known as a lex specialis piece of legislation. So don't worry about that term. That's a Latin term. What it means is there's a bit more detail in relation to the processing of people's personal information over the internet, over web, over email, over SMS, mobile, all that kind of stuff. So there's more detail. So we've got the principles of data protection, they've arrived. We've got the detail of more defined rules and regulations, which are going to be completely consistent and completely aligned with the GDPR, coming on stream next year. So hopefully that's clear. What that means, though, as you can see from this slide, is that until the EPR, the e-privacy regulation, is formally adopted, we are still having to comply with the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulation, or PECA. But I am going to give you a kind of glimpse as to what I think is going to be in the e-privacy regulation, so we can start to think about how do we navigate our thinking in relation to those matters as well from today. So it's not that complicated in my view. We just got to be aware that, really, going back to what Seth Godin was saying, we're living in a world where it's much more permission driven, and I think that's really important. And again, just to remind you, the points we were just talking about, the more they trust, the more they share, the more data you get. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. So in many respects, a lot of the commentary, which I happen to think scares people, is very negative. I really like to see things from a different point of view, and I hope you do too. Let's be positive about this. Let's think about doing things according to global standards. Let's make that a virtue of how we do our business and why we do the things we do. And I certainly think being with SolarWinds in Amsterdam a few weeks ago was a fantastic opportunity to really get that energy from people, that they really do want to provide an absolute world-class service for their clients. And that's really brilliant. And they embrace this stuff. They don't run away from it. And I hope you do too. I hope you embrace that. So we've got to understand the principles in order to really understand what we're doing. And again, I'm not going to go into any great detail because we've got a bit to get through. But remember, there are 7 principles, and that should make life a bit easier. A couple of features for you before we move off this slide. First, to begin with, this is replacing legislation that's been around for nearly 20 years. So you can imagine it's not going to completely rewrite all the rules as we've understood them. In many respects, this is evolution rather than revolution, but it's also brought to the surface things that perhaps were under the surface. So if we just take the first principle of lawfulness, fairness, and transparency, what you may not realize is that that point about transparency was kind of under the surface under the previous directive, 9546 EC, and it's now spelt out. And that gives you a hint as to why that's important. It's really important that we are transparent what we're doing, we're accountable, and of course accountability is also a principle. As you can see, that's the 7th data protection principle. It's only a sentence in the GDPR, but happens to be one of the most powerful, in my view, the most powerful. So you've got transparency, accountability, and putting control back in the hands of your customer, your client, your supporter, your employee. There's other features as well, and of course, those things have been in place for a very long time. One of the challenges, though, is data minimization. And that's something which marketing and salespeople may have a bit of a struggle with. And that's no criticism. It's just that over the years, we kind of like to collect data, don't we? In fact, you never know, it could come in handy one day. The GDPR puts a kind of stop on that, really. It says, look, you're going to reboot your thinking about that, because you should only be processing, because collection is actually processing as well. You should only be processing personal data for the purposes for which you need to deliver your product or service, or if it's a free app or something, information society service. And you shouldn't be over collecting. And also, data minimization is about not having everyone in your company having access to everything, because that again is a bit dodgy, is a bit risky, and again isn't in compliance with these principles. So keep these principles in your mind as we go through this afternoon, because we have to comply, not just one or two of them, we've got to comply with all of them, and that does help us understand what we need to do. So processing of personal data is another thing we need to keep in mind. So we've got the principles in our minds, we've got to think about the lawful basis. And there are only 6 lawful bases. And this is where all this confusion that you may have been subject to is coming from. People think that you have to use someone's consent in order to process their personal data. Well, I can tell you that's not right. There are lots of other ways in which you can process someone's personal data without getting consent. It's what is ever appropriate at the time that's really important. And you've got to link that to your purpose for which you're trying to process their personal data, and also take into account the relationship you have. This will become much clearer as we move through this webinar. So remember, the other thing, which again doesn't seem to get a lot of attention, is that if you can provide the product or service, if you can do your marketing and your sales activity without having to process someone's personal data, then you're expected to do that. It has to be necessary. And we just seem to flip over that point so fast, we don't even know it's there. If we can do the things we need to do, but without processing, we're expected to do that. So again, that may be a bit of a surprise, but that's something which is worth thinking about. And of course, the other thing to think about, and I think as marketing people, this is something which we should be pretty good at, is actually keeping records. Because let's face it, everything we do has to be measurable. We talk about inputs, outputs, outcomes. All of those things are measurable. So we kind of have grown up thinking about how we measure inputs, outputs, and outcomes anyway. So this should be second nature to us. But anything we do in relation to data, personal data, should be recorded. And that's really important. It all comes back to being transparent, being clear, being very precise in terms of the reasons why we want to process someone's personal data, and making them feel comfortable about that. You know, telling them that's what we're doing, and that's really, really good, and actually committing to making sure that we're adhering to those principles that we were just talking about. So that brings us to the legal grounds. The legal grounds that sit behind the principles that sit behind these legal grounds. Don't forget about those, but these are the legal grounds, and we're going to be talking about a few of those this afternoon. We're going to be looking at, in particular, consent, and we're going to be looking at legitimate interest. And you'll notice immediately that consent is at the top of the list and legitimate interest is at the bottom. Now, there has been some commentary about this, but let me put it straight. These grounds are of equal legal validity. Understood, accept that. So what we're not saying is consent is the best ground and legitimate interest is the worst ground. We're not actually saying that. They're all legally valid grounds. That's fine. But my point to us this afternoon is this isn't some random list. This list has been very carefully thought through, and we started with consent because if you think about it, consent can be an ideal way to provide an example of accountability, transparency, and control. I mean, that's pretty obvious. Legitimate interest could be appropriate, but remember, we're not getting someone's consent to process their personal data. It may be appropriate, it may not be appropriate, and that's what we're trying to unpack today. So think about the context, not just about what we're trying to do, but the context. That's really important. Another thing which you won't read in the GDPR, although I'm sure it should be in there, is the test of creepy or cool. This is something which I tend to talk about now and people kind of like, because in many respects we can get so caught up in the legality of everything, we lose sight of the fact that actually we are human beings. We like to behave in a human way, and in many respects we're talking about people's personal data. What you may not necessarily perhaps appreciate is that the GDPR is in fact a human rights piece of legislation. It's about the human rights of people, and it refers to the European Convention of Human Rights and other regulations like that and other laws like that. So we mustn't forget this is about people. And actually, knowing what the right thing to do is sometimes something which we have a feeling about. Doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do is something that we've all kind of grown up and understand. We know the difference between right and wrong. I hope also we know the difference between creepy or cool. If something feels creepy, it's unlikely to be lawful. So let's just unpack what we mean by consent before we get stuck into legitimate interest. And I know we're halfway through, but it's probably been worthwhile just rehearsing some of those principles, just looking at the legal basis to get it in context for us. So consent has definitely changed. And I don't mean we've now got consent. We have had consent, but now there's a certain quality about it. It has to be freely given. It has to be informed. That's really important. So people have to have the information in order to make that decision. That sounds reasonable. Has to be appropriate, specific. In other words, what are we asking for someone to consent to doing? And that's really important. And of course, we can't kind of be a bit grey or a bit misty about this. We have to be unambiguous. And ultimately, it's not what we want, it's what they're doing. So it has to be an indication of their wishes. Although it says in the GDPR an indication of wishes, it's actually of their wishes. So it's very much seen from the point of view of your customer and your client. And that's really, really important. It also means this on this slide. It means that when we do look to getting consent, we've got to make sure we've recorded that, because the burden of proof is now on our shoulders as the organization responsible for making decisions as to the means and purposes for processing personal data, as we would in this situation with sales and marketing. We're called the data controller. That's really important. So we are the data controller. We're not the data owner, though. That's the data subject. But we have a burden of proof to satisfy that we've got consent. And of course, this is important. It has to be distinguishable from other matters. And that means in every case, all those legal grounds, remember there are 6, in every legal ground, there has to be a data privacy notice. That's really important. It's the only absolute right in the GDPR. So if we're going to process someone's personal data under consent, they need a data privacy notice. And that has to be intelligible, easily accessible, and in plain language. You could argue they should have done that with the GDPR, but never mind. So it has to be, and it has to be separate from any terms and conditions as well. And remember, the other thing about consent, which again people have forgotten about, I think, is if you're asking for consent, it's got to be just as easy for someone to change their mind and perhaps think, well, actually, I'm going to withdraw my consent now. It's got to be just as easy to give as it is to take away. And remember, it's what's the most appropriate legal basis for processing someone's data. I'm not going to go into great detail about children because that's a whole area in itself, but clearly under the GDPR, member states have this wriggle room that I mentioned earlier, where they can set the age limit in relation to what is a child, and then when we need to get their consent, if we're going to process their personal data under consent. So in the UK, across the whole of the UK, including Scotland and Northern Ireland, that will be 13. And that's going to be law as of tomorrow. So that's good. But you know, you try to talk to my 11-year-old about consenting to go onto a social network site, she'll tell me to go away in polite terms or impolite terms. No, it should be polite. You can't really think that we need to talk to 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds and say, look, you can't do that without my consent. That doesn't make any sense, does it? But anyway, it is what it is. If they are a child, we can't process their personal data without the consent of an adult, and that's a guardian or parent. That makes sense too. But of course, when they reach that age of 13, in terms of the UK, certainly, that is no longer valid. We have to go back to that individual and get their consent. So for my daughter, I've got 2 daughters. My other daughter is 16. Of course, she's now feeling much more like a grown-up because she's being asked for her consent now. And I hope she uses it wisely. So there's also another aspect of consent. Again, don't want to get too dragged into this today because, again, we haven't got time to go into the nitty-gritty of everything. But this is about special personal data. And that means it's genetic, biometric, things which are very personal to you and me, maybe our sexual health, our religious or philosophical beliefs, our ethnic origin, our political opinions, all that kind of stuff you can see on the screen. So this is going to affect all of you who are in some way processing health data. You may be capturing this other stuff, but health is the big trigger for that. And you kind of go, right. So we're now processing not just personal data, which is that stuff which can identify you and me, and it's a large amount of data that could do that. We've got some special data, and that actually attracts a higher level of protection. And actually, we can't process special categories of personal data without explicit consent. But outside of that, you just need unambiguous consent. And interestingly, just for those of you who are interested in the sort of the genesis of the GDPR, originally everything was going to be under explicit consent, and they just thought it was just too difficult to make that workable. I kind of agree. So really speaking, unambiguous can be the expression of wishes which could actually be acted on by changing your browser setting or something like that, or your actual behavior. But when we're talking about explicit, it really has to be written, and it has to be very precise in relation to the purposes for which you're giving consent. And I hope that helps you. So that's what we want to say about consent. So let's now turn our attention to legitimate interest, which sounds really interesting, doesn't it? Legitimate interest. And under the GDPR, and I don't tend to quote article numbers all the time because that sounds a bit boring sometimes. We don't necessarily need to know that. But in this case, let me share with you, it's Article 6(1)(f) of the GDPR. And what it says is processing will be lawful if it's necessary for the purposes of legitimate interest pursued by the data controller or the third party. So we have to establish actually it's necessary and there's legitimate interest. And of course, except where such interests are overridden by the interests of the data subject, and they call it the rights and freedoms, as you can see there. And of course, particular special protection needs to be given where a child is involved, and that kind of makes sense. So let's put that to one side and just hold that thought in your mind. We're talking about legitimate interest being necessary, but it can't override your and my interests as individuals. And that's quite important. So it's not automatic. That's the first thing you should think. It's not an automatic, what I would call get out of jail card free. If you like Monopoly, you get a get out of jail card, don't you? So it's not one of those. And that's really important. So data controllers do have legitimate interests, and that's absolutely right. And we're going to look at one which is important, which in fact, direct marketing is a legitimate interest. But of course, in doing so, we've got to take into account the rights and interests of other people. And I guess that's the thing that we're really talking about, the sort of balancing act that we need to do, the kind of weighing up, actually, is this the most appropriate basis for processing? Or are there more appropriate bases, like consent, for example, or maybe we have a legal obligation, which we're not going to cover today, but again, that could be one as well. So some interests of the data controller are likely to be legitimate because they are strictly necessary for corporate governance or legal compliance issues. So, for example, we will have to tell people, tell the tax authority or the health authority about any injuries at work, for example, or have to account for how much we're paying you so you can pay your taxes. I mean, that's, you know, there's no if or but about that. We've got to do that. But we're acting probably under a legal basis for doing that anyway. So there may be things like safety that have to be put in place. And again, we have a legitimate interest to make sure that people don't get harm or damage, whether they're contractors and employees or whether they're members of staff, or members of the public. So again, you know, those things have a legitimate interest in. And other interests are legitimate because they're routine, if you like. But in all of this, and this is where we're getting into the nitty-gritty bit now, we've got to do this thing called the legitimate interest assessment, or LIA test, and that's what we're expected to do. And in the GDPR, there's explanation notes, which is actually quite useful, given that it's the biggest regulation ever produced by the European Commission. It's handy that there's some explanation notes to it, and they're called the recitals. So technically, although they're not law, they're actually quite a good way of working out what these guys meant when they wrote the thing. Legitimate interests of a data controller, including those of a data controller to which personal data may be disclosed, or of a third party, may provide a legal basis for processing, provided that the interests of the fundamental rights and freedoms are not overriding. So they've kind of gone back on that point again, which we've already seen within the regulation. So we're looking at a balancing test. In many respects, it's an expectation test as well. So what can someone expect, which is reasonable and appropriate, if we were going to rely on legitimate interest for processing their personal data? Now, I thought about this and I thought, what's the most efficient way of kind of getting you to get up to speed on this? And I thought, well, actually, the guidance produced by the ICO is really terrific. I'm very fortunate I work with the ICO. I haven't written this guidance, but I have written this book, the GDPR Handbook, and it is based on the guidance they've produced. It's based on the guidance that the Article 29 Data Protection Working Party have produced, the conversations I've had with the European Commission as well. So I'm very lucky to be working with them. And I also edit a journal of data protection and privacy. You probably think I spend all my time just thinking about all this all the time. Well, I sometimes even dream about it, and that's very sad. But, I have had lots of people kind of feed into me in terms of their thinking around legitimate interest and contracts and consent. So I'm quite fortunate that I've been able to look at what's really important in this landscape. And I think the Information Commissioner's Office here in the UK do a terrific job in trying of unpacking this. So here we go. Legitimate interests are the most flexible lawful basis for processing, but you can't always assume it's the most appropriate. So bear that in mind, the appropriateness. It's likely to be the most appropriate where you use people's data and what they would reasonably expect. That's the point I've just been making, which have now this is the important bit, minimal privacy impact. In other words, what that means is it's to do with stuff that you're doing which is of a lower risk, not a high risk or very high risk, but of a lower risk. So legitimate interest immediately is ruled out where you're processing someone's personal data where it's high or very high risk. Again, not getting through very clearly to people. Again, really important point not to overlook. If you choose to rely on legitimate interest, and remember, these are not my words, these are the words of the Information Commissioner, you are taking on extra responsibility for considering and protecting people's rights and interests. Now, you kind of think, well, hang on, aren't you doing that with everything else? Well, yes and no. If you use consent, you're transparent, you're talking to that person about the purposes, you're being upfront, and they still want to do that on the basis of consent, terrific. And you should make it as easy as it is to give as it is to remove that consent. Fine. You start talking about legitimate interest. You're saying, actually, I've got a legitimate interest. I don't need to rely on consent, but of course, I need the basis in order for me to rely on that legal ground. And that means you've got to take into account, as we've been talking about, the other person's rights and freedoms and interests and make sure that you're not overriding them as well. So it's important. In the UK, we've just had this new Data Protection Act, which comes into force tomorrow, a bit like the GDPR at the end of its transition period, timed together. And in certain cases, public authorities, so you may be from a public authority, they may have an opportunity of using legitimate interest because technically they can't under the GDPR, but under UK law, they could possibly in some circumstances use legitimate interest as a basis for processing the personal data of a citizen. They actually have a legal basis for doing that, so they don't have to rely on consent and they don't have to rely on contracts. They've got other powers. That's the reason why it's there. But they could rely on legitimate interest if they wanted to, but in a small way, and that's a UK thing. So if we're thinking about how do we justify using legitimate interest, because you might think, I like the sound of this. This sounds really good. It sounds like it's less of a aggro. And by the way, I've heard all those arguments, particularly from lawyers, who think consent's too difficult, either go for contract or legitimate interest. When I talk to American companies, they don't even go that far. They go, oh, we're just going to rely on legitimate interest. And you kind of go, have you read the GDPR? Do you know about this test? And I don't think they do. So you've got to identify a legitimate interest. You need to show that processing is necessary to achieve that legitimate interest. And you need to balance that against the rights and freedoms and interests of the individual. If it comes out that actually it's absolutely appropriate, it isn't creepy, it's absolutely fine to do that, and it's the most appropriate way in order to achieve the objectives that we're trying to achieve, you're good to go. So you need to think about that. Legitimate interest can be your own interests in that situation, or it could be the interests of other third parties that you could be working with. That's okay too. It can also include commercial interests as well. So don't be shy. You know, just think, oh, you have to be completely altruistic and also have legitimate interest to help the world to be a better place. Well, that'll be nice, but it doesn't have to be. It can be commercial, but remember, it's a balancing test. And that's where a lot of people forget to think about that. And it has to be necessary. Remember, processing has to be necessary, something I mentioned about 20 minutes ago. You know, if you can achieve what you want to achieve without processing personal data, you're expected to try that and to do that. So those are the reminding of those points. And again, the other point to remember is you need to record the basis for your legitimate interest, because you have to share that with someone. That's fine. Goes back again to when we're talking about principles. If you remember right at the beginning of the webinar, we were talking about transparency, accountability, and control, if you remember. And this falls into that whole area of being transparent and accountable, doesn't it? And of course, remember, you still need that data privacy notice. So that data privacy notice will need to explain to someone that you're relying on legitimate interest. You don't need their consent to give that notice to them. You just need to give that notice to them, make sure they've got it, and make sure you've recorded that they've received it. And that's important too. So let's have a little bit of a closer look on the legitimate interest assessment. And as I've already said, it's a bit of a balancing act. Hopefully you won't fall off the wire. That would be very nasty, wouldn't it? So we've got 3 stages. We've got, if you recall, identify legitimate interest, stage 1. Stage 2, carry out a necessity test. And stage 3, carry out a balancing test. And clearly, if you can get past stage 1, you can go on to stage 2. It's a bit like our program at Henley. If you can pass module 1, you can open module 2. We've got 6, in fact. And so this is about making sure that we're doing all the right thing, because actually it's the right thing to do, and we are ticking those boxes in terms of the test. So we've got to pass stage 1, stage 2, and then stage 3. Stage 3, as you can probably guess, is the big one, actually. So I don't think we're going to have much of a problem doing this, do you? And what I've done here is I've put some questions. So again, if you're thinking about using legitimate interest, it's absolutely fine. Remember, has to be the most appropriate. Remember, lower risk processing, not high or very high. So is there a clear purpose? Well, I'm pretty sure you've got one. Is the processing necessary to meet one or more specific organizational objectives? Well, you're trying to sell stuff? Yeah. Is processing necessary to meet one or more specific objectives of any third party? May not, doesn't matter. Does the GDPR, e-privacy regulation, or other member state law specifically identify the processing activities subject to the completion of the balancing test and positive outcome? Well, it might do. I'll come back to that, because it does actually come into employment stuff. Okay, so there are your 4 questions, which I'm pretty sure you could probably answer. Yeah, we probably have. So we've got past stage 1. Great. Now, is there a necessity? Is processing activity important? Well, we probably go, yeah, it is. Is the processing activity important to other parties? Well, again, other parties that we may disclose it to. So we may not be doing the processing ourselves. Ah, that's interesting. Remember, if we can get away without doing the processing, we're expected to. But if we have to process someone's personal data in order for us to do what we need to do in terms of sales and marketing, are we going to share that data with a third party? And is that important? It might be. So again, we have to come across that and answer that. Is there another way of achieving the objective? So again, I've kind of been making that point, but it's a good point. Again, not really a massive problem. Then we get to stage 3. So you've cleared stage 1, you've cleared stage 2, and now you've got the balancing test. And this does go into a few slides. This is the one you've got to really kind of think, okay, so if we don't get past stage 3, does that mean we can't rely on legitimate interest? I think you're probably right. I think if you can't really get past stage 1 and 2, well, you've got a problem. You get past stage 1 and 2 and you get to stage 3 and you can't really get past stage 3, it's likely not to be the appropriate basis for processing data. Now, if all that sounds far too complicated, don't panic, because if you're in the UK, or indeed if you're outside the UK, there's a really super cool tool which the ICO has just released. And it takes you through some of these questions and it will give you an answer in terms of what your most appropriate basis for processing personal data is. Now, of course, they're not going to guarantee it's right every time, but it's not a bad guide, and I've seen it and it does work. So I would suggest you go to ico.org.uk to have a look at that. But while we're here, let's have a look at these questions then in terms of balancing test. Would the data subject expect the processing activity to take place? This goes back to the slide which I shared with you about being creepy or cool. You know, if it's not something they would expect, then you shouldn't be doing this. Does the processing add value to the product or service? Again, is it necessary? Really important. Is the processing likely to negatively impact their rights? Because again, if it does, you're dead. This killed it. You can't do this. Is the processing likely to subject to an unwarranted harm? Again, it's, you know, it may affect the rights and freedoms of other people, for example. Again, kills it. Would there be prejudice to the data control if personal data and processing doesn't happen? Okay, so there's a little bit of like, will this really be difficult for you if you couldn't do it? But you'd have to really justify that, and it'd have to be evidenced. And of course, that would apply to a third party as well, the rights of other people. And all the way through, you're answering this thinking, I wonder if there's a better way of doing this. And that's the thing that I want you to start thinking about. Don't think about this being an automatic response. Oh, I can't do the others. It's going to be legitimate interest. Go back and think again. And that's really important. That's why I guess this is helpful. Is there a two-way relationship in place, for example? And actually, you know, is that relationship close? Again, take into account the context, which is what we said at the beginning of the webinar. Really important. If you've got an existing relationship, that makes life a lot easier. Makes life a lot easier. Would the personal data processing limit or undermine the rights and freedoms? Again, what this is doing is it's forcing you, unless you're there already on the page, as they would say, it's forcing you to think through the eyes and experience and the body of that customer and that client. And that's really, really important. So I'll leave you to read the rest. But again, you know, it's really quizzing you as to really actually, do you really want to rely on legitimate interest? If you can pass stage 1, stage 2, and you can pass stage 3, and there's no other more appropriate ground, you're good to go. These are some examples. Direct marketing, so you're immediately sighing relief here. Direct marketing is a legitimate interest under the GDPR. In fact, it was an 11th hour compromise. Interesting. So that document I referred you to early on in the webinar, you know, the one from the Direct Marketing Association, go and have a look at that because it's really useful. And I think if that's something you want to do, that's great. So direct marketing is definitely legitimate interest, and also postal marketing is legitimate interest. And what they've said here is you don't need consent. Well, they're stating the bleeding obvious, aren't they, really? Because you're not actually using consent as a lawful basis here. You're using legitimate interest. So that's great. Employees data. Now, what's interesting is that there's a focus on how employee data is used within the workplace, and you can only really process that now under legitimate interest Of course, you have to carry out the legitimate interest test, but it shouldn't be too difficult to do that. Once you've done that, you have to share that, the result of the fact that you're processing someone's data on legitimate interest, given those reasons, how you've actually arrived at that conclusion. Because if you look at consent, which is what it's been traditionally, it's an equal bargaining position, isn't it? You're the employee, then you've got your boss, the employer, and you can't exactly say, no, I don't like that, because if you don't like that, they go, okay, well, you can't work here then, which doesn't seem to be very fair, does it? But unfortunately, that's life. So actually, they're saying, well, you know, we can't pretend that you've consented, even though you signed your name on that piece of paper. That isn't really consent. You have to use legitimate interest, and that's really where the general data protection is clear about, and there's guidance on that. Outside of that employment context, there could be other areas where you could use legitimate interest. That could be, for example, sticking these security cameras. Here in the UK, we are the most surveyed or surveillanced community you'd ever find. We've got cameras coming out of the garden. It's unbelievable. We've got so many, I've lost count how many I can count just driving to the shops. But security is fine, and that's legitimate interest. Of course, you've got to be appropriate in terms of how you deploy that technology. And you know, if you're just trying to guard a door, for example, you just can't capture the whole pavement and the street behind it. So should you use legitimate interest rather than consent? And this is kind of coming towards the end of the webinar. And in many respects, it's an expectation. And remember, it's not your expectation or mine as the data controller, or even as the data processor. It's the expectation in the mind of the lady screaming on the right, our customer, our client, if you like. And that's really important. From an employee point of view, there isn't really any argument there. If you're processing their personal data in order for them to do their job, then that's fine. There could be other areas where you don't need to process their personal data under legitimate interest. Maybe they've got a choice to join a discount scheme or a loyalty scheme or something like that, in which case you would then be more appropriate to use consent. So according to the ICO, you know, it is a high bar to clear. You know, you've got to justify this. You've got to evidence it. So this is stricter than perhaps you may have thought. And it may be too creepy to do. It really sits around, you know, around this whole area sits the issue of data ethics. So in many respects, that was a lot of detail. There were tests, there were questions, and you can look at that at your leisure. But actually, think about doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Think about reputation rather than just reputation. Have a look at this book. It's a really great book. It's about data ethics, and we're going to see much more about data ethics being in the media post tomorrow. So finally, a checklist, because we all like checklists, don't we? Because that's actually the bit we're interested in, I suppose. These are the checklists, and these come from the Information Commissioner's Office. Check, do you have legitimate interest as the most appropriate? Tick. Do you understand your responsibility to protect an individual's interests? Well, you do now. Tick. Have you conducted a legitimate interest assessment and kept a record of it to ensure that you can justify your decision? Well, you know how to do that. Have you identified the relevant legitimate interest in accordance with the GDPR? Well, we've had a look at that. Have you, and you can always read my book if you want more, have you checked that the processing is necessary and there's no less intrusive way? I've made that point a few times. I'm pretty sure you've looked at that. Have you done the balancing test and make sure you don't override the consumer, the customer interest in that scenario? Hopefully you won't. Do you only use individuals' data in ways which they would reasonably expect? Now see, unless you have a very good reason, well, you know, unless you're under a legal obligation, maybe to protect the safety of people, therefore we need security in place, you don't need to get consent. That is appropriate. Having those security cameras there is a reason, isn't it? So again, have to really question yourself about that. Do you use people's data in ways they would find intrusive or which could cause them harm? If you process children's data, you need to take extra care. I really wouldn't rely on legitimate interest to process children's personal data. Take it from me, that sounds too dodgy. Go for consent, go for adult and parental guidance, parental consent, don't go for legitimate interest. I really don't think you're going to stand much of a chance there. Have you considered safeguards to reduce the impact? Because Data minimization. Remember those principles, those 7 principles that we had up earlier. Yeah, data minimization. You recall that was principle number 3, wasn't it? Really important. Again, going back to who we are this afternoon, sales and marketing people, we tend to hoard lots of data, which is something I said earlier. We need to get rid of it. It's too much of a risk. If it were to be hacked or stolen or it got out, it could cause harm and damage, and we don't want that. And it will come back to us, and it will be an aggravating factor for any sanction and fine. So we're always thinking about reducing risk, and that's really important. If you're considering whether to offer an opt-in or opt-out, that really goes back to PECA. Remember, we talked a bit about PECA, the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulation. That means if you've got an existing business relationship with someone, you've been sending them stuff before, you don't have to do these bonker thing that people are doing, just sending these rather irritating emails saying, we want to keep in touch with you, please reconsent. Well, first of all, I don't need to do that, because you can continue to send me stuff, but give me the option to opt out if I don't want to receive any more. And if I don't have any relationship with you and you're trying to get me to receive more emails from you, you're actually in breach of not just the GDPR, you're actually in breach of the existing law. And believe you me, how many people are doing that now? Crazy, isn't it? So think about that. Think about your legitimate interest assessment, identify significant privacy impact. Remember what the ICO said, it's about lower level of risk, okay? So it's not, and Elizabeth has actually said to me, this is actually a higher bar to reach, really. So think about that. And remember, keep your legitimate interest assessment under review and repeat it if the circumstances change. Something you may have forgotten, actually, things can change. So it may not be the most appropriate, it may be appropriate to do it today, but it may change in the future. And don't forget your data privacy notice. And don't just think legitimate interest is your get out of jail card free, because it isn't. Here are those links I promised, which you can go to. Hopefully they'll all work. And there's a thing you might want to get a hold of. It's called the GDPR. That's the hardback edition. As you can see there, that's actually Liz Denham, and we gave her a copy of that. And of course, there's the book that I've mentioned as well. And that's about it. So with a couple of minutes to spare, I'm going to hand you back to Kim.
Thank you, Artie. Wow, lots of good information. I know I've learned some new things, and I'm sure our attendees have as well. To our attendees, thanks again for making the time to join us. As I mentioned up front, we'll be sending you an FAQ following today's webinar along with a recording. And if you'd like more information about GDPR, we invite you to visit solarwindsmsp.com and go to our GDPR Resource Center. Thank you again, Artie.
It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And I hope everyone is going to have a good data protection day tomorrow. Well, it's the 25th of February, 25th of May, and it's the start, at the end of the transition period and the start of a new world for data protection, privacy and security.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.